Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time for today's launch webinar on our new report on greening digital companies, monitoring emissions and climate commitments. My name is Vanessa Gray, and I'm leading the ITU development sector's work on the environment. I'm very happy to be here with you today and excited to talk about the findings of our report and to hear from our speakers who will be providing different perspectives on the topic of the report. And the press release and report were published yesterday, and we'll be posting the web link to the report also here in our chat. A few more points before we get started. We may have time for question and answers towards the end of the webinar. Please use either the chat function or the question and answer function in Zoom to send us your questions. And if you miss anything, don't worry, because we'll be sending around the link to the recording when it's available, and also we'll be sending the slides. We'll also prepare a webinar report for our event page. And then may I now ask everyone to add their affiliation in their screen names, and also to quickly turn on your camera so we can take a quick picture of the event. And I think Rosie or Rose can take that picture. I'm not sure if we have to change the view on of the event. Rose, are you doing this? Sorry, Rose, can you let us know when that's fine?
Yes, I just have to stop sharing my screen then. Sorry.
Great. I still see the ITU logo.
It's done, thank you. Yes, it's done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great. So to get back to the report, the report is the result of the collaboration between the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, and the World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA. So just a few words about these organizations. So starting with our partner, the World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA, was launched in 2018. It's a nonprofit organization that assesses the world's most influential companies' performance in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. WBA identified 7 transformations to put the world on a more sustainable path to achieve the SDGs. And to turn these transformations into action, WBA develops benchmarks to assess 2,000 of the world's most influential companies. And this includes its digital inclusion benchmark to evaluate the top 200 tech companies in their performance and enhancing access to digital technologies. The other one is the climate and energy benchmark that measures corporate progress against the Paris Agreement. So the WBA insights serve as an accountability mechanism and really are to incentivize companies to become successful drivers to change and to deliver on the SDGs. ITU is the UN Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technologies. It was founded in 1865, and we allocate global spectrum, radio spectrum, and satellite orbits, develop technical standards that ensure networks and technologies seamlessly interconnect. And with and through our 193 member states and over 800 sector members, including, of course, the digital companies, it helps improve access to ICTs worldwide. So we're involved in a number of climate change activities, including developing international standards, supporting the sustainability and the sustainable use of ICTs. We'll hear more about those in this webinar. ITU has partnered with others to set the ICT sector on a clear GHG reduction pathway in line with the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. And just last week, during the World Telecommunication Development Conference that took place in Kigali in Rwanda, over 2,000 participants from 150 member states reaffirmed the important role that ITU has not only in highlighting and supporting the use of ICTs for sustainable development, but also, and this is critical, I think, for what we're talking about today, really to address and to monitor the impact of digital technologies and on services on the environment. So the work that we will discuss today is critical for our understanding on how to deal with the world's most threatening challenges, the climate crisis. And just these last few weeks, we've witnessed again what the World Meteorological Organization has called a foretaste of the future, with heat waves starting earlier, becoming much more frequent and more severe because of record concentrations of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, including in many parts here in Europe. And again, our report is timely, and the kind of information that we are publishing through the report will be, I think, increasingly needed. So with this, I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Michael Mingus, who leads the WBA research on benchmarking digital companies and who has also been leading the research on this report. Michael has a long career in the ICT sector, particularly in the area of analyzing digital progress in developing countries. And I feel very privileged because from the beginning of my career, Michael and I have had the opportunity to work together on many different projects. Michael, you'll be presenting the key findings from the report. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Vanessa. So many of you may be asking why this report. Well, on the one hand, digital companies are playing a notable role in the race to a carbon-free planet. From huge purchases of renewable energy to investment in carbon removal, to issuance of green bonds, to lobbying, these companies are at the forefront of efforts to reduce GHG emissions. Digital products and services are also having a significant impact in enabling emissions reductions across other sectors. But at the same time, rapid digitization around the world is driving demand for digital products, resulting in rising electricity use. While COVID-19 led to a drop in global electricity use in 2020 for the first time in a decade, it is estimated that it rose 10% in the ICT sector. And where that electricity use is not matched by renewable energy, it is resulting in higher emissions. This report is the first to document the GHG emissions and targets of the world's leading tech companies. Next slide, please. The 150 companies were assessed by the WBA for its annual digital inclusion benchmark. As part of that assessment, climate data was collected from company ESG report. The table shows how companies have been grouped by region as well as 3 sub-industries: hardware, telecom services, and telecommunication services and IT services. And as you can see, most of the companies are in East Asia, North America, and Europe, which are the powerhouses of the digital economy, with the majority of leading tech companies headquartered in those 3 regions. Next slide, please. The report uses the methodology followed by almost all the companies, the corporate accounting and reporting standard. And the emissions data are broken down into 3 scopes, as shown on the right, a figure I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So scope 1 and 2 are the company's operational emissions for the use of fuels and electricity. And most digital companies report at least these. Also note that scope 2 allows companies to report 2 different figures: a location figure based on the default grid emissions factor, and a market figure based on the proven renewable electricity that companies have purchased. Finally, scope 3 refers to companies' upstream and downstream activities. And consisting of 15 categories, scope 3 is important in order for companies to measure their entire emissions footprint. So if we look at the practices that companies follow for decarbonization, next slide, please. First, they need to measure their GHG emissions. Another thing is to establish a target, then reduce energy use through better efficiency, work with suppliers to get them to reduce their emissions, and then use renewable energy. And finally, after all possible, emissions that can be reduced or avoided, then look to carbon removal. So in terms of, next slide, please. In terms of measurement, we found gaps in the availability and depth of the climate data. 20 mainly government-owned or privately held companies report no emissions data. Scope 2 disclosure is sometimes inconsistent, although the GHG protocol calls for both location and market-based emission. Some companies report only one, and then they don't specify which it is, whether it's location or market-based. Some companies do not report Scope 3 at all, or they only report easily calculable categories like business travel. It is recommended that climate data be assured by third parties, as we noticed that some errors were made in the reporting of companies. And another suggestion is that companies have a standalone environmental report explaining their calculation methodologies, disclosing a time series of emissions data, and also including verification statements. And one really good example of that was the environmental report from Swisscom, which follows ISO 14064, an international standard for reporting and verifying GHG emissions. Next slide, please. In terms of targets, next slide, please. Oh. Rose?
Yes, sorry, I'm here. That's just a technical issue. Sorry, I'm coming.
Okay, in the meantime, I'll continue. So 86 of the companies have established an emissions reduction target. And these targets vary by ambition, scope, and measurement. For instance, 38 companies plan to reduce all their operational emissions to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030, while others have targets farther out into the future. Some companies have intensity-based targets, which makes it impossible to forecast absolute reduction. And there are cases where the intensity ratio is improving, but emissions continue to rise. Not all companies include their entire footprint in their target reductions. And among some 60 companies with non-intensity targets at a 2030 or earlier target end year, it is forecast that operational emissions will drop around 60%. If you could just go back one slide. Yeah, so that's, you can see the graph of the reduction among the 60 some companies where you can measure their target over the next 10 years. Okay, next slide, please. Many digital companies, like those in other sectors, are reducing energy use in their facilities through the use of sensors to control temperatures, constructing green buildings, and converting to electronic vehicles. But there are also energy reduction features specific to the digital sector. For instance, 5G networks are over 6 times more energy efficient per unit of data than 4G, and fiber broadband is at least 100 times more energy efficient per unit of data than copper delivered broadband. There's more of a mixed picture with data centers. Power usage effectiveness, or PUE, has reached its limit in older data centers where easy energy efficiencies have already been achieved. But on the other hand, newer data centers and hyperscale data centers have PUEs close to 1, which is the perfect case. Next slide, please. And supply chains account for the largest portion of upstream emissions for some companies. And as a result, a number of companies are working with suppliers to report emissions data, for them to procure renewable energy and adopt targets. The CDP supply chain project provides support for members to request that their suppliers report environmental data through CDP. Another initiative is BT, Ericsson, and Telia, which are among the founders of the 1.5 Supply Chain Leaders Initiative, which is supporting SMEs with their emission disclosure and target setting. Next slide, please. In terms of renewables, digital companies are leaders in green energy procurement, as well as initiatives for tools and mechanisms to drive and scale renewable energy markets. The ICT sector accounted for almost half of global corporate renewable energy procurement in 2020, and 6 digital companies are among the world's top 10 largest corporate purchases of renewable energy. However, the next slide, please. The left chart shows that while 13 of the digital companies are paying for 100% renewable energy, only 4 of them are actually getting it at all times and hence be able to report zero scope 2 market emissions. So Google has been a pioneer in trying to solve this problem. While it procures 100% renewable electricity for its operations, it finds that only 67% was delivered to its data centers on an hourly basis in 2020. The company is committed to achieving carbon-free energy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where every kilowatt of power is matched by carbon-free electricity on the grid where the electricity is consumed. And Google's a founding member of the 24/7 Carbon-Free Energy Compact, an initiative coordinated by the United Nations. Next slide, please. 16 companies reported being carbon neutral in 2020. All but 2 are from Europe or the United States. And almost all of these companies are using voluntary offsets for their remaining emissions. Though there is debate about voluntary carbon offsets, they are recognized by the Kyoto Protocol. And also offsets are having an impact in low and middle income countries through investment in renewables, reforestation, and related initiatives such as clean cook stoves and pay-as-you-go solar, which are contributing to sustainable development. One of the speakers today from Proximus is involved in a big cook stove project in Benin that maybe she will make reference to. In terms of the, next slide, please. In terms of low and middle income and upper middle income economies or LMIs, almost a third of the companies are headquartered there. And a number of the other digital companies have operations in these LMIs. The bulk of emissions in LMIs come from Chinese headquartered companies, since China is an upper middle income nation. Many LMIs face challenges with access to the grid and reliability. And as a result, mobile base stations require their own generation, and this has often been diesel fuel. So efforts are being made by some companies to convert these generators to solar or to put the base stations on the grid. Another challenge in LMIs is energy markets, where they tend to be more restrictive than those in high income nations. And we believe that unless LMIs open up their energy markets, they will find it increasingly difficult to attract foreign investment from major tech companies. Next slide, please. The report also looks at how digital technologies are being used across digital company footprints, but as well as in other sectors. So for example, IoT sensors are being placed in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, enabling energy reductions. Blockchain is facilitating renewable trade on distributed energy networks. AI-based techniques are producing more precise forecasting of wind and solar production, therefore optimizing the use of renewables on the grid. Robots are disassembling used digital devices like smartphones to extract raw materials, which can then be reused. And apps such as video conferencing are driving emissions reductions, while ride-hailing companies are offering consumers the opportunity to select electronic vehicles. Next slide, please. Digital technologies also play an important and noble role in decarbonization. Use of digital services contribute to avoided emissions and is sometimes referred to as scope 4. While all types of digital companies help to enable emissions reductions through their products and services, arguably, telecom operators have the largest enablement impact by providing underlying network connectivity. So 9 of the telecom operators included in the benchmark calculate their enablement emissions. And in total, they were 7 times larger than their operational emissions, and the enablement emissions were more than 1.6 times these companies' total footprint. Of course, enablement should not be used as an excuse for companies to delay reducing their own footprint emissions. Next slide, please. Some digital companies are moving from carbon neutrality through voluntary offsets to net zero with carbon removal. And digital companies have announced investment of over $4 billion in carbon removal initiatives. One of them is Microsoft, which is aiming to not only eliminate its emissions footprint by 2030, but remove all its historical carbon emissions since founding by the year 2050. In its latest fiscal year, Microsoft bought over 1 million tons of carbon removal, the world's largest purchase ever. And projects include reforestation, biomass sequestration, as well as direct air capture. And it's written a guidance manual along with Carbon Trust on the kinds of carbon removal projects that would qualify for its procurement. Next slide, please. So in terms of the results of the overall results of the report, next slide, please. This slide shows the operational emissions and electricity use for the assessed digital companies. So they account for 0.7% of global location-based emissions. Market-based emissions are 18% smaller. And at 425 terawatts of electricity accounts for a higher share of the global total at 1.6%. Almost a third of the electricity the companies purchased was renewable in 2020. A couple of caveats here. This is not the entire ICT sector, so that it would be larger, but also we could not calculate the total company footprint, so their upstream and downstream emissions due to not all companies reporting this, as well as the possibility of double counting. And I think one of the speakers will speak to some of the challenges in measuring emissions across the entire ICT sector. If we look at the, next slide, please. If we look at the results by the headquarters of the company and what region it's in, it's shown in the left chart. Although East Asian headquartered companies make up less than a third of all the companies assessed, they account for 60% of the group's emissions and half of its electricity use. In terms of carbon intensity, East Asian headquartered companies have twice the emissions per dollar of revenue than North American or European headquartered companies. And reasons why East Asian headquartered companies lag their peers in other regions and steps to catch up will be discussed by two of the speakers today. Next slide, please. We assess the companies on the quality and completeness of their data, their performance, and how ambitious their targets were. 16 received an A grade, all headquartered in Europe and the United States. And they're spread across all the three different digital industries. Emissions disclosure, targets, and performance of these companies serves as best practice for other companies to emulate. Next slide, please. To conclude, as we saw, digital companies and technologies are having a notable impact on reducing emissions in other sectors, but standard guidance for measuring this is needed. Second, companies headquartered in East Asia account for a disproportionate share of emissions and electricity use of tech companies. Decarbonization needs to be speeded up in that region. Third, developing countries are lagging in liberalizing their energy markets. Governments need to expand the scope for renewables or may find that they will have difficulty attracting investment from multinational tech companies. The gap in GHG emissions reporting needs to be narrowed. While some companies excel in complete disclosure of all scopes and third-party verifications, others are lagging. Agreement is also needed on the terms carbon neutrality, offset, and net zero. And more granularity is needed reporting emissions at the country level and disclosure of which suppliers are providing scope 3 upstream emissions. Guidance is also needed on product use emissions to avoid double counting. Final slide, please. So I'll end by leaving you with some food for thought. And we would also like to thank Pernilla Bergmark, the next speaker, for all of her insightful comments on the report. And I would like to thank you all very much for your attention and time. Back to you, Vanessa.
Great, thank you very much, Michael, for this great overview of the report. Next speaker is Pernilla. Mrs. Pernilla Bergmark is the principal researcher on ICT sustainability impacts from Ericsson. And Pernilla, you're also active in ITU standardization as a co-author of ITUD Study Group 5, the question 9, as well as co-author of the exponential roadmap for 1.5 degrees aligned climate action. Again, as Michael already said, thank you very much for your insightful comments and your contribution input that you provided to the report. And with this, I will give the floor to Pernilla, and I think Rosie is sharing her slides. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and I'm very glad to be here this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're listening in from. I think this report is very important since it provides so much data. I think that is something we are lacking, comprehensive data sets on the ICT sector. There are too much guesses and guesstimates around. Please, next slide. So I first wanted to start with summaries and insights of the report, and of course this comes from a perspective of someone who has worked a lot on the sector. So much of the content is not new. But I think there are several things that I wanted to bring up here. So first, it's a massive task really to collect as much data as this. It's not that you have a database where you can just go and collect it, but there should be tons of reading before you have collected this data set. So congratulations to your work on this way. One thing that I thought was really stood out to me when reading the report was the regional differences. And I think that is something that we have not talked so much about in the past, and something we should learn from, and also see how we could mitigate that. Another thing was, of course, the importance and challenges of procurement of low carbon electricity. And I really appreciated that you framed not the figures in the challenges. And also, of course, the challenges in around scope 3, whether it comes to data collection or to interpretation of the data. So next slide, please. As you said, your numbers were representing the part of the sector for which you had collected data. So in our research, we have been trying to estimate the full carbon footprint of the sector, and this has also been used by ITU as a baseline for decarbonization trajectories. So our estimate is that the full sector represents 1.4% of global emissions, roughly. This is an estimate from a somewhat older study, but the current research indicate that this level stays, and this represents also for the operation 3.6% of electricity usage. And of course, what we can see in this diagram is that this has raised until 2010 and then stayed rather flat. But the challenge we have is that we now need to halve the emissions during this decade. So it's a great challenge. And of course, we see that data curves are raising enormously. So in terms of efficiency, the sector has done very good, but we need to continue. Next. So in your report, you compare with the aviation sector. I think that comparison is not entirely fair. So we think a valid number to keep on mind is that it really using a smartphone for 50 years, including the share of network and data centers, is equal to going across the Atlantic, Europe, North America, one time return trip. So the difference is when you start to look from a one user perspective is quite big. Next. Just to put our work into perspective, so what we need to do is really that we must halve emissions this decade, then again next decade towards reaching net zero at the latest of 2050 at the global scale. And this is really the challenge that we need to respond to. Next, please. And when we started as ITU to work jointly with GSM, AGSC and the Science Based Targets Initiative to develop the trajectories for our ICT sector, it was not at all obvious that this was the ambition that the sector should have. So we had quite some debates in this work. So for this reason, it's good to see in this data set that among the leading companies, halving emissions by 2030, that is rather a low ambition, because many companies, and this refers to scope 1 and 2, are really focusing on getting net zero much earlier. Then, of course, it's the width of the sector that we need to cover. So it's great and important with the leadership of the front runners, but we need to get the full sector to follow. And we also, as ITU, has developed the 1471 standard, which sets the conditions for being net zero. Next. So all our work in the different standards that we develop within the frame of SG5 on the carbon assessment, sorry, on carbon assessments is based on this standard L1410, which looks into the footprint and also the enabling effects, but on a higher level of ICT goods, networks and services. So it lays out how to do the assessment in a very detailed way. Next. And of relevance to this report, because you kindly refer a lot to the standards that has been developed within SG5, is the L1420, which is on the organizational carbon footprint. This standard is aligned with both the Ghg protocol and the ISO 14064. And it looks at embodied emissions as part of scope 3 based on LCA and estimates. But the current edition is fairly old, it's from 2012, so a revision is ongoing. And in particular, this work will consider work by GSMA to develop scope 3 reporting, and scope 3 is really the key challenge for this work in this next edition, and that we could also see in the report. Next, please.
Pernilla, you wanted to signal this is for 2 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So L1450, that is a basis for assessing the ICT sector footprint. And this is coming from a bit of a different perspective compared to the study that we are talking about today, because this comes from the perspective of the deliverables of the sector. So it looks into the networks, it looks into the user devices and the data centers rather than the company perspective. Then the company reporting is an important data source for this type of assessment. Next. We skip this one and go to the next. So just to say that when it comes to the indirect effects of ICT, we call them sometimes enablement effect when they are positive. There is an ongoing effort right now. We are actually working on this standard this very week to provide more detailed guidance on how to assess the effect of using ICT deliverables in different sectors. And this is a quite challenging task. There are a lot of complexities beneath it, but we are expecting to have a publication during 2022. Next. So very quickly, how can we reduce ICT carbon footprint? So I think Michael already said most of it, but I think 3 main things are to go renewable in all parts of the supply chain. Electricity usage is representing about 80% of the overall footprint. Is to build systems in a smart way and to phase out old equipment, and collaboration within and across value chains is critical. Next, please. And for more detailed guidance, there is this work performed by the UNFCCC in their climate action pathways. There is a particular part on ICT and mobile action. So this is something which gives guidance next. Across different time horizons, but also for different actors. Next, please. So to finish off, here are some future opportunities in consideration of the work performed by ITU and the World Benchmarking Alliance jointly. And I think there are great opportunities to collaborate closer with ITU SG5. For instance, we could investigate opportunities for alignment on sector boundaries and categorization between the two. I think that it would be helpful to have, you are clearly referencing your sources, but to have more details on where to find information. As we have said, that it's really a daunting task to find it sometimes. And then to have a more clear distinction between carbon neutrality and net zero. I think you do a lot of explanations around this, but in the data set, it would be great to do this. I also think we could have more clear distinctions when it comes to target on reductions and compensations. I think there is an opportunity to leverage the insights from this data collection on the diverse reporting format, and that could be an input to standardization, especially when it comes to company reporting, and also to leverage experiences of data collection we would very much like to see an ITU database on related to the ICT sector carbon footprint. And I think you have a lot of learning to bring into that process. And we are actually in the ITU TSD5 working on a recommendation on how to set up such a database. So it would be great to exchange on that. So I think this finished my presentation. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and good luck.
Great, thank you very much, Pernilla, also for the looking at some of the possibilities for the future. Our next speaker is Mrs. Chuying Catherine Wu, who is climate and energy campaigner with Greenpeace in East Asia. Chuying, you're the author of the 2021 Race to Green report on analyzing tech companies from China, Japan, South Korea on their climate action and renewable energy use. And we look forward to hearing your presentation. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks, Michael, for organizing this awesome event. And also thanks for inviting me to talk more about our report, Race to Green, which is analyzing tech companies from China, Japan, South Korea on their climate action and renewable energy usage, which is like released last year, December. So yeah, so I think, Rosie, can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so for today's agenda is quite straightforward. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about Greenpeace and more into Race to Green, our report, and also talk about more about like the key findings and recommendations. So next slide, please. So yes, Greenpeace. Greenpeace journey actually started way back in 1971. So we actually celebrated our 50 years birthday last year. So it originally started with like a nuclear protest on a small island called Arctic. So that marked Greenpeace mission, which is protecting a green and peaceful world. But like today, Greenpeace is one of the largest environmental organization in the world, and we operating in over 55 countries across the globe. And so we directly work with local communities on the front line as they protect the environment that they call home. So and for the working style, so like Greenpeace uses a non-violent creative action to pave the way towards a greener and more peaceful world, and to confront the system that threaten our environment. Yeah, so that's basically who are we as Greenpeace. And next slide, please. So yes, so last year, Greenpeace East Asia, so we released our very first original tech companies ranking. And so the content and the key findings will be introduced later, but the first question that we really asked ourselves when we started this campaign was, why do we want to focus on East Asian tech companies? So as Michael, so I think there are similarities with what Michael just like talked about, but from my perspective, there are, but also like in our report, there are 3 reasons. So the first one is the regional climate momentum. So as we all know, in 2020, China, Japan, and South Korea, they all announced their climate pledges, which has been perceived as a regional, like climate momentum. And with this momentum, 3 countries would have more opportunities to achieve their climate pledges with more synergies. And the second reason is the growth of like tech sectors. So while the tech sectors is like growing rapidly, the electricity consumption is also rising. And in this report, you can find a number which is very astonishing. So the electricity consumption of 30th companies that we evaluated in our report this time is actually exceeded Thailand's electricity consumption in 2019, which is a very big number. And with the majority electricity powered by fossil fuel in 3 countries, the emission of this sector will be constantly rising in the future. And please go to next slide. And for the third reason is that, so when we're compared with the Asian tech companies' climate performance with their global counterparts, such as Apple, Google, Facebook, so we actually found that Asian tech companies are absolutely like behind. So well, like you can see here, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but in this table, so while Apple has transited to 100% renewable energy back in 2018. So on the other hand, Samsung Electronics, for example, hasn't, like yet setting up their global renewable energy objectives. So as we can see from this example, Asian tech companies are like behind. And please go to the next slide. And so in our report, Race to Grain, so last year we evaluated 30 leading companies in the region. So we selected company based on 3 criteria. So the first one is the 2019 Forbes top 100 digital companies list. And we also take into consideration of companies' market value and also the social impact. And we actually developed 4 matrix to evaluate these leaders' environmental performance. So which are climate commitment, climate action, and also their data transparency and also their climate advocacy. And all data that we collected were from the public sources like companies' ESG report, media articles, and also companies' public website, where in general, where the public can obtain the information without any membership or fees. So, and the data collection time was till the 30th of September last year. Yeah. So that's the basic overview of our report. And please go to the next slide. Yes, so that's the methodology. You can see it more in detail. So, and next slide. So yeah, here is the important part, the ranking result. So yeah, so you can see here, Sony ranked the first with a C+, but we just like recently noticed that Sony just renewed its commitment scope and timeline, which would result in a different score. But yeah, we can talk about later. And for some companies, they are also falling behind. Like we can see here, Samsung is quite behind with like a D, and also Xiaomi is also having a D- here, and some other companies as well. Yeah, and with that in mind, we can go to the next slide, and we can talk about more into the details. So yeah, so here are some like key findings that we discovered from the ranking. So the first one is Sony received the highest, like overall score on the ranking as a result of company's previous commitment in 100% renewable energy and its pledges to reduce its carbon emissions. And as I just talked back then, so like Sony's new pledges would help it to get a higher grade, but unfortunately, it's just been made recently. So yeah, but besides the commitment parts, we actually noticed that like Sony is still quite low on its, like renewable energy usage, despite its just a renewed 2030 100% renewable energy commitments. So in 2020, the renewable energy ratio was just accounted for only 7% of the company's total power consumption. Well, like I'm sure Ms. Keiko can bring us some new insights of companies' recent work in combating climate change. So besides Sony, so leading global brands such as Samsung Electronics, Xiaomi, and Alibaba were among lowest score among well, like in the ranking. So they received D or D- grades. But well, like of course, like Alibaba has just like committed to carbon neutrality by 2030 after the report published. But still, like Samsung Electronics and Xiaomi have yet to issue a global 100% renewable energy pledges, or like Ghg emission reduction targets. And also for Xiaomi, they performed quite poorly in the data transparency category. Yeah. And on to the next slides, please. So,
Ying, sorry, you have 1 minute left, please.
Oh, wow, that's quite quick. So maybe we can just like skip these and go into the recommendation part. And so, well, like when we analyze all these like key findings through our report, we also like provided some like recommendations for the companies, and I can just like pick some very important ones to speak about. And so for us, setting up a target to achieve 100% renewable energy across the supply chain by 2030 is absolutely important. So the timeline 2030 has been like brought up like several times throughout the report. The reason is that so this number for like China, Japan, and South Korea is absolutely essential, because 2030 for China is the time for its carbon peak, and for Japan and South Korea is like the energy transitioning time. So it's absolutely important. And besides that, companies should also have like a very ambitious Ghg emission reduction targets that include entire supply chain, or not just like, and also just not rely on the use of like carbon offsets. So that's also very important. Yes. And so that's basically all from me. And if you go on to the last slides, there are some like quotes from Greenpeace. So yes, so as Greenpeace, and we really want to like see more and more companies in the region and use their real actions to fight against climate change, and not just empty worded. So this is Greenpeace always advocate for. So like positive change through actions. So yes, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Excellent. And it's good also to see the similarities between your findings and our report. The next speaker is Mrs. Keiko Shiga. Keiko, you're a general manager at the environment section of sustainability of the sustainability department at Sony Group Corporation, and leading environmental governance for the entire Sony Group, with over 15 years of experience working on environmental issues. We just heard that Sony did well on the Greenpeace index, and with this, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, for your kind introduction. And thank you for this great opportunity to speak about Sony Group's environmental activities. Can you go to the next slide that shows the agenda for today? Yeah, I'll be talking about those topics you see on this slide. Next slide, please. First, the overview of the Sony Group. We started out as a small electronics company back in 1946, but now we are a conglomerate group that encompasses from entertainment businesses like gaming, music, pictures to, yes, electronics. We also own financial services in Japan. Our identity as a company is a creative entertainment company with a solid foundation of technology. Next slide, please. And a brief history of Sony Group environmental activities. Our activities dates back in 1970s, but more recently, we established our long-term environmental plan that we call Road to Zero in 2010, and it aims for zero environmental footprint by 2050. But yes, already quoted by many of you. Just last month, we just announced that we are accelerating our climate change target year of Road to Zero, and also RE100 by 10 years. Next, please. Yeah, just a quick slide to show that we organize our activities by two pillars. One is responsibility, and another is contribution. Next, please. So our Road to Zero plan is an integral part of our responsibility pillar. The plan aims to achieve a zero environmental footprint throughout the life cycle of our products and business activities by 2050. And we set medium-term targets every 5 years, working by backcasting from the ultimate goal of zero environmental footprint by 2050. And they are formulated from 4 perspectives of environment and 6 life stages of a product. And of course, one of the 4 environmental perspectives is the climate change. Next, please. So as I said earlier, we just accelerated our climate change targets by 10 years. And for the Road to Zero plan, this means that we aim to become net zero by 2040. Next slide, please. So let me elaborate a little bit on our new target. So we based our target setting philosophy on what Science-Based Target Initiative defines as the net zero. I think there are different definitions, but we based it on SBTi's definition. So first and foremost, we reduce our scope 1, 2, 3 emissions by 90%, in line with the 1.5 degree aligned pathway that you see as the purple dotted line on the screen. Then towards the end of our reduction journey, we gradually implement carbon removal practices and ultimately to the same amount of emissions that's left in 2040. Which should be the remaining 10%. So we have the near-term SBT, which is a 1.5 degree aligned mid-range target for 2035, and we are now aiming for the long-term SBT for 2040. Next, please. And as an interim measure to achieve net zero by 2040, specifically for scope 2, we aim to achieve our RE100 goal, which is to operate 100% renewable electricity in our own business sites by 2030. Yes, as mentioned by Catherine earlier on, we struggle to procure more renewable electricity in the region, but the number we will be publishing in our sustainability report that will be issued in August, the numbers are a lot better from my perspective, so please stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. So this is the overview of the GHG emissions by the entire Sony group. You can see that while we regard the reduction of scope 1 and 2 emissions are our fundamental responsibility, the largest emission is scope 3. And within the scope 3, the largest of the emissions is from the use of our products, the category 11, and followed by those from the purchased goods and services, which is category 1. And we'll be working on measures you see on the right-hand side to reduce those emissions. So for example, for the site, the office or the factory type of buildings, we accelerate the energy saving and also we implement more renewable energy. For the supply chain area, we try to engage partners to save their energy and use renewable energy. The collaboration with them will be the key. Also, we select low carbon or the carbon neutral products and services to kind of foster that in our practices. For our product and service area, we continue to develop energy saving products, and we also encourage users to use energy saving features. Next, please. We also value transparency, and we work hard to provide extensive information disclosure on our sustainability report. For example, you see the GHG emissions per life stages in the yellow boxes shown here. This is in our sustainability report. Next, please. Another example is our historical disclosure of scope 1, 2, 3 emissions for the past 3 years. You can also find this in our sustainability report. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. The challenges. Let me touch upon some challenges we face. So we are a global company, but most of our manufacturing takes place in East Asia and specifically in Japan. We may be regarded as a consumer electronics company, but we also manufacture devices in Japan. So they consume the most energy. So for us to meet our RE100 target, it is imperative that we secure stable and ample renewable electricity at an affordable price in the region. So we are putting efforts such as installing our own solar panels, doing intercompany electricity transfers, buying green power menu from utilities, and also renewable electricity certificates. But it's really not enough. So we also reach out to have conversations with the Japanese government so that they understand that there is a need for us and for other global companies to, procure such renewable electricity. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And good also to hear about the challenges that you're facing to learn about those. The next speaker is Ms. Catherine Baltz, who is the Sustainability Department Lead at Proximus. Within that role, you define the strategy and the roadmap for Proximus's fourth strategic pillar, Act for a Green and Digital Society. Catherine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon for those who are on the other side of the world. I'm going to run through a bit of our ambitions, and you can move to the next slide, please. As said by Vanessa, sustainability is actually our fourth pillar of our company strategy, and we have set quite ambitious targets moving, where, as Catherine mentioned, the need to acquire 100% renewable electricity. We are doing so in 2019, but as Michael also mentioned, it's not already on a full 100% hourly matching rate. That is definitely something we're working on, but which is rather linked to the unavailability in Belgium also of having enough renewable electricity being available. Now, the next step will be to move towards fossil fuel-free cars by 2025, and have also on the circular side, because we've got a circular and a carbon emission objective, to remove 90% of our waste, to then come towards as an ambition to be 100% renewable energy by 2030. And I know Catherine mentioned that we should bring that one forward, but it needs to be said also that especially towards the cars, and we still have about 5,000 cars running in the company. The market is not completely ready, especially if we look at technical cars for trenching works. That market is actually not ready yet to go to fully electrified fleet there. So by 2030, we want to be completely 100% renewable energy. So meaning our scope 1 and 2 to zero without any offsetting. So not using any more, as Michael mentioned, the stoves project like we currently support yet for the offsetting, but really have everything reduced. And also come to a zero waste and a truly circular company. The truly circular part from our side there is especially on the devices and the network and data centers part, where if I link towards Keiko's presentation earlier, where her challenge is really on the scope 3, also in purchased goods and the use of sold goods on that one, installing that circular mentality and really working on the circularity of the devices is actually having a great impact on your scope 3 too. But I'll come to that. I'll give an example on one of the next slides. To then come to 2040 net zero emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3. SBTi aligns, so meaning we've submitted our net zero ambitions towards SBTi to have them validated according to the newest standard, which was launched in October there. So as Keiko also mentioned, the 90% at least, and with some carbon removal, which will gradually be brought into the picture there too. So you can move to the next slide. Now, to give a bit of an idea of what the roadmap to get there is actually our scope 1 and 2. Scope 2 is zero because we acquire 100% renewable electricity. Our scope 1 is only 6% of the full picture anymore. So the biggest challenge really remains in that scope 3, as Keiko mentioned too, where we also have on the procured goods and services is the biggest chunk. And the customer use of products is the second one, a bit very similar actually to Keiko's situation in Sony, but with the opposite effect that we procure more than what the use of our products are. Now, we've actually on the procurement side, to give the example of the circularity, which is having a great effect. Up until a few years ago, we weren't going into the circular design. So we weren't yet in a refurbished state of mind and trying to prolong the life cycle of our products that we put ourselves into the market a couple of years ago. And there, the amount of those devices that we bought was actually good for about 18% of our scope 3. While in the meantime, by installing the circularity and by really refurbishing also and trying to get back the products that we put into the market, refurbish them and give them a second life, we managed to bring down that amount of CO2 in our scope 3 from 18% to only 2% anymore. So really the circularity and scope 3 is actually a great link. And in terms of the use of products, by going into discussions with our suppliers, we and then really rethink the products from the beginning. So really go into an eco-design type of mode. We also, with our newest internet box that we put in the market, we reduce energy by 25%. Usage of energy. So you can really work on that by just installing the circular mindset. We can go to the next slide. As Michael also mentioned, there's also a part where we have a beneficial effect on the environment through the use of our products and services. And we calculated that the avoided emissions last year were actually already larger than our full footprint, which was left. And we are really focusing on that one with effectively IoT solutions, which is probably the biggest potential, which is still there. This currently doesn't include any of our IoT solutions yet, as we're still in negotiations with Carbon Trust, who does the calculations for us. On that one, on which part of the smart solutions that we put into the market do we account for? Because you can really, well, you could say everything is for you, but that's not really true because you only provide the connectivity there. So you need to be a bit reluctant of calculating everything, because otherwise it would already be 2-3 times. But anyhow, there is a big potential, especially in the energy sector, with smart energy solutions. The mobility sector and agriculture is also a big value pool in terms of avoiding emissions at our customers. And we can move to the next slide. Now,
Catherine, one minute, please.
Yes, okay, so I'll go quite quickly because I touched upon a lot of these things. So as said, circularity is really a motor towards also reducing your scope 3. The renewable energy is ruling out fossil fuel and the energy efficiencies, especially towards the 5G network and the fiber, which enables that. The enablement part with the smart solutions is what is the goal towards 2030, and then towards 2040, it's really on the supplier engagement program in really working together with our suppliers and engaging with them to bring down their emissions, also move towards LCAs on a product basis and not having standardized EIO emission factors being used in your scope 3. But the suppliers are really changing the mindsets also internally when we buy stuff, because it's the biggest chunk of our scope 3 still, when we buy stuff that we think differently and that we include very circular initiatives also into our RFP processes. And I think that concludes my presentation there in terms of the roadmap towards net zero emissions 2040.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Our next speaker is Ilias Yakovidis, who's advisor on digital aspect of green transition within the European Commission in DG Connect. And Ilias, you work on EU-wide measures and initiatives to improve the energy and material efficiency of ICT, including the European Green Digital Coalition. And you manage the European Parliament pilot project supporting this coalition that is working on science-based methods to estimate the net environmental impact of digital solutions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, congrats to everybody who is behind this report. So to you, Vanessa, and of course, Michael and others, that was impressive work. It's a lot of work. So I'm not gonna repeat what Pernilla already said. And it's just the beginning, because we understand by reading this, I understand the challenges ahead of us. But we needed to start with this because the scope 3, as everybody sees in the tables, is the major category that we still don't know really what's happening. So the scope 1 and scope 2, it's good. And all of the companies that we see here in Europe are doing great, and US. There are challenges in Asia, that's good to know, that was very clearly demonstrated. But I would worry more about scope 3 and the standards behind measuring and capturing and avoiding double count of scope 3. So we know very clearly where we're going. I will say things that we have not touched upon, so to avoid saying already things that were covered. One is the ICT sector is very dominant. I mean, just look at the stock market or the 2,000 companies that you're dealing with. The ICT sector should also produce and invest in production of renewables. So when we talk about renewables, it's the offsetting is good and it hopefully goes to the right investment, but also there are and should be kind of investment in the renewables, both to production, but we are such a sensitive and important sector to make sure that the electricity grids actually can get more renewables and be stable to decarbonize the energy grids and the electricity grids, and to integrate microgrids and to decentralize them. We play a major role. So we have this double head always as ICT companies. So it's a critical sector that we are clean as possible, as soon as possible, but also enable the energy mix improvements for the others. We have measures in the EU because we have said we were the first region, as you know, we set the climate neutrality goal. And already for 2 years, we are working on our target to make the data centers in EU climate neutral by 2030. Okay, that's quite an ambitious goal, especially, I mean, it's not a problem for the big ones. It's more the smaller ones, the non-professional ones, let's put it that way. We have also some measures with respect to what I care more about is the material. That means the circularity of the devices. And here I would like to stand and say the following. The scope 3, category 1, 11, for example, if you really want to reduce that, we have to go a step further than just the usual reduction techniques of the company's emissions. We need to start thinking of circular business models. We need to reduce the impact and the e-waste and our own scope 3 emissions by looking what else I can do serving people's needs with less material, less new devices and more recycled materials, recycled devices, repaired, refurbished, remanufactured, anything but recycling. Recycling is already the beginning of a bad trip because you really don't get through recycling quality materials. And it's really difficult to get these micrograms of rare earth from the mobile phones. So we will issue eco-design criteria at the end of this year for mobile phones, tablets, and laptops, hoping that some of that material efficiency can be actually put in the design phase already. But in addition to that, we really would like to stimulate, we cannot regulate, but we would like to stimulate circular business models of your industry and your product. So as I said, to get as little primary resources in the ICT value chains and more using existing and keep the value of existing products and equipment. So that is something that we did. We just issued a regulation called eco-design for sustainable product regulation. And we have a new concept called digital product passport, because what we need and what you need as a company, you need to track and trace where your products are and when your materials coming from. So the full value chain traceability will give you also, will empower you as manufacturers and most of the ICT companies to go into this extended producer, ownership. I would already go beyond extended producer responsibility. So that is something that I would like to really stress as something that kind of missing in the picture. And now the standards. I mean, ITU, you're leading this work. The all 1400 series of standards, it's very much leading the world. Your cooperation with ETSI is very good. And the standard that you did with ETSI, the L1410, together with the L1420 that Pernilla mentioned, is already 10 years old. And we would really like to see if that could be revised. And the work that we're doing with the Green Digital Coalition on the Scope 4 emissions, as you call them, would like to contribute to that. It's already referred to, the L1410 is referred to in the EU taxonomy, because what I really personally care much about is let's make sure that the sustainable ICT is under it's on the menu of sustainable finance. So doing ICT sustainably, producing it and using it sustainably should be on the menu of sustainable finance, which is not at the moment. For that, we need standards that the green public procurers, the promotional banks, the EIB, the World Bank, and others can clearly say, yes, if I invest in this type of hardware and software, and in this type of usage of it, this I can call sustainable finance. At the moment, we know, and we have code of conduct for data centers, but we need it for many other aspects of ICT. So we actually have a metric, what sustainable finance means to greening the data centers. But I would encourage other ICT companies and other sector of ICT to look at what they can do, telecoms in particular, but also how those things are used in a circular and sustainable way. So this, I let you with one concept, so I want to kind of gain the time that we lost on the way, and that is the concept of the net environmental impact. So I go a little bit beyond the report, and I would like to say that the report highlights how can we lower our emissions as a sector, as a company, but also how do we lower the emissions of a tool, hardware, software, digital solution tool, in order for that digital solution to have a enabling effect. So if it has a low impact itself, direct impact, there is a chance to have indirect impact positive, so that the net environmental impact is positive. And again, then we have all the chance for sustainable finance, scaling up, and faster deployment. So this is something that we do in Green Digital Coalition. Proximus, of course, and Ericsson are part of it, and so are another 34 companies. And we would like to invite others that are on the call to join this effort. So thank you very much, and congratulations again for this impressive work. I was waiting today for today's evening, the event, to start disseminating it widely, because I have some places I would like to send this to.
Great. Thank you so much, Elias. And I see we have just 2 minutes, which I would like to use just for a few takeaways from this very, I think, super interesting discussions. I like the way all of you complemented the key findings of the report. So just a few points. So we saw that digital companies consume vast amounts of electricity, and we heard that they produce, the ICT industry produces 1.4% of all global carbon emissions. But a number of the companies are early adopters of innovative and sustainable mechanisms, which help drive and scale renewable energy markets. And a number of companies are really leaders in green energy procurement. At the same time, we saw noticeable differences among the digital companies in their approach to decarbonization. Some are committed to eliminating their entire carbon footprint before 2030, while others, especially some of the bigger emitters, are moving slowly. Here we heard we need to get the entire sector on board, and Pernilla mentioned a number of standards available to guide companies, the ITU standards. We also need to use the climate pledges and take advantage of the momentum to get everyone on board. And the 2030 date, I think, was mentioned a number of times, and we've seen recommendations to have moved to 100% renewables by then. We also heard about some concrete steps on how to reduce the Scope 3 emissions. I think this was mentioned a number of times in the supply chain. Many of the companies going green are from North America and Europe. So again, these differences. We've learned that a growing number of studies are emerging to show the significant impact of ICTs that they're having on reducing emissions in other sectors. Enablement is now a calculated metric for some digital companies, showing how use of their products and services are avoiding emissions. And this includes broadband-enabled home working, online conferencing, smart metering. We heard a figure on taking a flight versus using your smartphones, for how many years you can use it. But also we heard about the potential impact of especially IoT in this area. So developing countries face particular challenges, including lack of access to the grid in rural areas, dirty grids, and frequent outages. Keiko highlighted some of these challenges and others as well in her presentation. And here governments need to create a favorable environment for clean energy, allowing renewable energy providers, but also eliminating taxes on renewable products, unbundling grids, and allowing on-site use of renewables. On the data side, we had a lot of discussions here. We need to move away from guesstimates, and most of the digital companies covered in the report publish the basic metrics needed to analyze their operational climate performance. However, there is a wide gap in quality and quantity, but it's also a massive task to collect and understand the data. And we heard the Scope 3 data is fragmented and is challenging for many companies. And there's also a current concern also of the measures used resulting in double counting. So more emissions reporting is needed at the country level, and guidance also needed on product use and enablement emissions, which is also a very complex area to monitor and understand. We heard about the need for collaboration across value chain and the kind of efforts that companies can take to provide incentives to companies across the value chain. Installing a circular mentality, we heard, was important, which will have a great impact on the Scope 3. And we need to go beyond the usual reduction techniques and look at circular business models to avoid recycling, but focus on the steps before. Elias, you mentioned the eco-design criteria and the design phase. And you also said we do not just need to regulate, but stimulate, for example, through sustainable finance incentives. And we have already tools to move towards a full value chain traceability, such as the product passport. And you also mentioned the net environmental impact, so the lowering the environmental impact of the tools that we use. So to summarize, I think there's still plenty of work ahead for us to ensure digital companies continue to eliminate emissions and reach carbon neutral and net zero climate targets. I'd like to take or end by taking this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today. If you have any further questions about our climate change activities, please be in touch. Also, we can put you in touch with the speakers, and we will also start discussions on how to continue our work on tracking emissions and climate commitments. So hopefully we will be back soon with more. Thank you to everyone. Thank you and have a good day.
Bye.